Rev up your engines! Today we're taking a trip back into history. Not just one, but two Austin 7s. The English answer to the Model T Ford. Smaller and half the weight. Now, if you really know your history, these are actually the first BMWs too. BMW merely sold these as BMW. The first BMW ever sold was actually an Austin 7. And when we get back into the past, this is when cars were simple, yet well made. Check this out. You got your fan, but check it out. There's a grease fitting. They make them so you can grease them and they can last forever. And of course, this is a more modern one on it. It has a distributor. The earlier ones were magneto systems. And it's got a Zenith carburetor. Reminds me of my old English motorcycles. And we got a flathead engine too. It's a small engine, it's 750 cc's. They were rated at 10.5 horsepower. But like I say, they're a lot shorter than a Model T, and they actually weigh about 1/2 of what a Model T weighed. Now, of course, the English are really bred for racing, not just horses, cars too. Gordon made a race one out of this. The body only weighed 20 pounds. I'm not making it up. They're streamlined, they're lightweight. They got as much as they could out of these little bitty engines. Simplicity itself. 3 lug nuts. They still have spoked wheels here. They're not wooden wheels. Now, they came in both convertible form and a hard top with a little rag top on it. And this, of course, is the English version, right-hand drive. But they sold in the United States, too. This is an American left-hand drive. Now, you might think, oh, no, a hand crank engine, you're going to break your elbow. It's an accessory on this. They do have electric starters on them, and they came that way. And as all carbureted cars, they got a simple fuel pump. These babies are simple. Now, you don't want to get stuck in traffic with one of these because just like the early Model T Fords, they didn't have water pumps on them. Got a belt-driven fan, but it just goes by gravity. The hot water rises, the cold water sinks. It cools the engine enough. Just don't take one of these on a parade the 4th of July when it's 100 degrees outside, because it will overheat. Just like an English motorcycle, it's air cooled. You don't want to drive them too slow, too long in the heat. Now, as you can see, they definitely came from carriages. They look like a carriage inside. They got a lot of room so you can get in and out. They only had 2 doors in those days. And here they are with English instrumentation. I'm used to that in my own motorcycles. It does have a starter. You don't have to crank it. That's only in an emergency. And like a Model T Ford, you got the distributor advance here to start it up, to get a little more acceleration, oil pressure gauge, amp gauge, fuel gauge, and a little bitty speedometer that's maybe a little bit on the optimistic side. I really don't think this thing could go 75 miles an hour unless you're going down a really steep, long hill. And of course, that car's always were in those days. You can take the windshield up and down, and they're pretty cool. And the wiper, well, you got a pretty simple wiper here. You got one blade that goes back and forth. Now, of course, it doesn't have a radio, but it also doesn't have a heater, so you're going to be wearing gloves and a hat in the winter in this thing. What does it have in the back? A basket. I like the sentiments, too. Absolutely no nagging. Now, in this convertible tour, it even came with chrome-plated bumpers. Pretty snazzy looking car, but look at that tiny exhaust. You want to talk about small. It's got the English steering wheel on it, you can see. The original leather seats are still there. They're worn out, of course. And it's so small, you can see, here's the wheel wells. You're sitting next to the wheel wells. Check this out. You can advance or retard the ignition and the gas. It does have an electric starter on it. You can see there's the electric starter. Yes, they have electric starters on them. Interestingly enough, you might think these things are old. Back in those days, the English were actually ahead of the time. This baby's got an aluminum block. It's got a cast iron head, an aluminum block. The English were doing that long before anybody else was. But as I said, especially this one, you got 2 little tiny blades on the fan, no water pump. You don't want to drive this thing in traffic for very long. Good thing it's in Rhode Island. It doesn't get that hot here most of the year. So let's start this thing up, see what it sounds like. That's one big advantage of these engines that have side valves and not overhead valves. They don't have much horsepower, 10.5, but they can run forever. If you ever go to any old county fairs, see some of those rides, most of those are still running on old side valve engines. They can run forever. ever. Now he claims that this is the only one left in existence in the United States. Here's all the specs if you want to read it. Now with the way this thing's set up, there's no wonder there's louvers for your hood. Because of that simple cooling system, it needs all the airflow it can get coming in here and coming out there. But the air conditioning, it's a little weak. This is the air conditioning. The air comes in here and blows on you. Now this came with spare parts. Here's the original air pump. He's got a spare head, a spare transmission. Now, back in the day, rebuilding a transmission wasn't that big of a deal like today. They were small and simple. If you're only pulling 10 horsepower, you don't need to have any super rugged one. They have a tiny little transmission, it'd be very easy to rebuild, and he even has a spare aluminum block over here. Of course, you want it to break, so he's got some spare drums here too. You can't go to AutoZone and buy these things. Now, the interesting thing about the man who owns these tiny little Austin 7s is he also owns a gigantic house. They used to be like a furniture factory. He's got space everywhere downstairs and has this gigantic building to put more stuff in. You're certainly car mad. Look at all his cars. And this is just the beginning. I tell you, the guy's got space. Well, it's all his space, including back up here. And yes, the bucket truck is his too. He says he uses it to clean his windows. And inside, this man has everything. I told you he has space. Into clowns, here's something he's fixing up. Big Bertha game. If you know what this is, it's showing your age. But you gotta be careful when you come in here. Check it out. Now you know a little bit about Austin 7s. The English idea of a Model T. It's zippier driving around. This particular one might be the only one of its kind left in the United States, making it not only smaller and half the weight of a Model T, value-wise, and certainly an extremely unique car and a piece of history. And of course, this being the American version with a left-hand drive on it, makes it even more valuable. Now, maybe old, solid, and interesting enough, the brake system works by wire. There's no brake master cylinder under here. It doesn't have one. So considering this thing weighs 990 pounds or so, you can get away with a brake system that works by cables, just like an old 10-speed bike. When he found this Austin 7, it was a lucky 7 day for him. And you can't buy this one because it's his baby. And again, he does have another one, which at the right price to the right person, he will sell that one. Right-hand drive. And you got a sunroof with this one. And here's some bonus questions and answers. Jermaine Dalfar 23 says, I got a 2000 Volkswagen Jetta 2.0. I looked at the live data when it was running. When they're idling, my fuel trims are 25%. But when I give it gas, the fuel trims act like they're going to go back to zero. I bought it used and it's got that stupid cold air intake. Could that be the problem? Well, it could be. You're running lean. I never advise putting those cold air intakes. You got to modify more than just bolt that crap on. You got to change computer software. There's a lot of stuff you really have to do to it right. But you could also have a classic sign of a vacuum leak. So I would check for a vacuum leak first. Because when you're idling, if you have a vacuum leak, you're going at a lower speed. A medium or small vacuum leak can make it run lean, so it will add fuel when you're idling. But once you rev it up and you're going fast, the engine is sucking a whole bunch more air. So that little vacuum leak becomes a much smaller percentage. Let's say if you're just idling, maybe that vacuum leak is adding 25% air, so it'll run 25% lean. But when it's sucking all the 5, 6, 7 times more air when you're going full throttle, that little leak is much smaller percentage, so your fuel trims could go down to normal. So check for a vacuum leak first. It could easily be a vacuum leak. Check out my video, Fixing Engine Vacuum Leaks, any kind of smoke creating machine, and see if you can find a vacuum leak, because it could very easily be a vacuum leak. Well, you know, they're now racing around electric cars, and here's an interesting facet. It's called the Extreme E race cars. It's based in England, I guess. And they have a big old ship that they travel around the world with, and the interesting thing is, these are electric battery race cars, but they're going to be powered and recharged by hydrogen fuel cells, because they're racing all over the world and they don't want to be dependent on the power grid wherever they're going. So the race cars themselves are going to be recharged with hydrogen fuel cells that have the electricity, and then they recharge the battery in the race car. Scotty thinks, why not just race hydrogen fuel cell cars instead? Then you can bypass having to recharge them. But of course, you know, all this stuff is just starting out, so they realize that they're going going all over the world, and a lot of it's a PR event. So they'll be going to areas, and they're probably going to have races in deserts and stuff where there isn't any power. So not a bad idea. Use hydrogen fuel cells to generate the electricity, then use them to recharge the electric cars. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.